think the issue of political prisoners is also tricky, because I think it's easier, whatever easy is, right, to organize around mass incarceration rather than to make the connections about anti-communism, COINTELPRO murders, repression within a democracy. I mean, the depth of the repression kind of makes it look like a dictatorship in relationship to Black radical life. And I think to do that kind of political thinking is still unpopular. So there's a moment in the film where Davis actually pauses, and she's incredibly eloquent, but it's like, what happened to Ruchell Magee, right? Because he's still in prison, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, finally, what only can be uttered is that, well, he was intransigent in terms of me separating, but in order for me to go forward with this trial and to survive, and for this documentary to be made and for us to be here tonight, Ruchell Magee had to be severed from the political process of freeing all political prisoners. So if we go into Russell Maroon Schultz, who's in Pennsylvania, and there's going to be an event in Chicago April 10th. He has a book coming out, right? He's the only US Black political prisoner that's ever escaped twice on his own. So it's different from Assata Shakur. And so that's why he was named Maroon, but he's been tortured for decades, right? So for me, it's we, me, whatever, we're in this odd moment of celebrating our gains and our achievements, but also trying not to make icons out of them, right? And not get into a celebrity trap and forget the facts that other people have laid out, that they're political prisoners in the United States, that the only ones who have received pardon, or rather clemency, have been white anti-imperialists under Clinton or Puerto Rican independentistas. And Clinton briefly considered Leonard Peltier, but nothing about Black political, like don't even think about bringing it up. And so there's something about the criminalization, not just of Black life, but Black resistance that becomes unspeakable.
I think I would also say, you know, you think of people like Zaid Shakur, who kind of try to reimagine the notion of Black people in general being political prisoners all the time, even those who went into prison for derivative crimes, because the notion being that within a country where you are basically constantly targeted, that we all in some ways are political prisoners when we get in. And so there's been that conversation as well that people have brought to the fore, and that was particularly the case in the 1970s. And you saw a lot of that, right? You saw a lot of people making those connections between the ghetto itself being a prison and that image, right, that people kind of put out there. I think it's problematic, though, in some ways to think about political prisoners because of the reasons that were mentioned by Joy about the separating out people when so many people are behind bars, and we kind of have to think about movements that need to be in place to uproot the whole thing, and that when you make celebrities out of certain people, it leaves a lot of other people behind. So I think there's a lot of conversation in groups where folks are talking about prison around what's the value of bringing some ideas and some people up, you know, maybe at the expense of others.
I want to ask Joy maybe if you could talk a little bit about the connection between her scholarship and her activism. It was alluded to in the film. She talked about all the writing she did while she was in prison. If I'm not mistaken, she wrote a very seminal article, Reflections on the Role of Black Women's Role in the Community in the slave community while she was incarcerated. But can you talk a little bit more about like how that has been a continuing thing in her life in terms of what she's done research on in the academy, but also how she's translated those ideas into action?
Yeah. Well, it's great that this has taken place, period, but it's also great that it's taken place within an event connected to feminist theory, because Angela Davis is a pioneering, I hate that word, but anyway, she's an influential feminist theorist, influential political theorist, and her scholarship and her activism converge, right? And so my personal introduction to Angela Davis happened in the 1980s, and it was through a women's group connected to the Communist Party, Women for Racial and Economic Equality. And from that, I ended up getting a Ford postdoc and chose to go to Santa Cruz to work with Davis. So I actually got to see her in the classroom setting, right? I was able to see how she mentors, the way she influences, and that's part of what led to the Angela Davis reader. The essay that she did in prison, The Role of Black Women in Community of Slave, directly took on the construction of feminism as a white middle class or white bourgeois endeavor, in which placing oneself in the family, right, could actually be seen as a gift. So she kind of flipped the script on its head. If you're reading Betty Friedan or some of the other feminists at the time, their subjugation was within domesticity in the household. And Davis argues in this piece that actually for enslaved women, what they can provide, the only thing they can give freely is not their labor outside of the household, right? But their labor in reproducing, not as potential, more enslaved workers, but reproducing intimacy and love and connection in the family. And that's sort of what I noticed in the film itself. So part of that is tied to domesticity. Even though there's this flight from it within conventional feminism, Davis sort of pointed to it as a gift. Nurturing through touch, nurturing through food, nurturing through consolation, nurturing through compassion. All of these skills that are considered to be feminine or maternal and so not competitive, right, in the marketplace, are skills that she pointed to as survival mechanisms, but also in some ways transcending the bonds of shackles.
I was going to ask you, maybe Mariame next, if you could talk a little bit about Davis's involvement in the prison abolition movement.
I think I came to also read Davis actually through her autobiography first, when I was around 17 years old, and I didn't understand her at all. At that point, I hadn't lived anything, so I had no idea what the hell was going on. But I thought for sure a Black woman who, was writing about this period that I was really becoming fascinated with was something I needed to know and understand. It's not till later that I really began to focus a lot on her work as a feminist and kind of as an internationalist and a humanist. And so the work that she's been doing around abolition is really to help set a container for a lot of us who are trying to think through a world without prison. What would that look like? What would that mean? How do you make sense of that? She was very influential in forming Critical Resistance, an organization established, kind of launched in 1997 through a conference that happened in 1998. It kind of solidified itself. And these are basically, it's an organization that's looking to internationally think about how we get to a point of abolishing the prison industrial complex, which is defined basically as an overlapping set of interests that include government and industry, and that uses kind of surveillance, policing, and incarceration to be able to address problems that are actually problems that are social, economic, and political in nature. And she's really, through her book, Are Prisons Obsolete?, asking us to push against what we have, which Alice Walker always calls the ceiling on our brain, the notion that we can't envision anything outside of the prison as the form of accountability and punishment in the world, and that we need to be able to do that if we're actually going to be free, if we're actually going to end violence. Because at her core, she talks a lot about the notions of violence and harm as things that are incredibly detrimental to our being free. And so the interest is in trying to figure out how we address those things without relying on prisons, which are inherently racist and inherently sexist, heterosexist, classist institutions. You can't get away from that. And so because we have that as a kind of space where we're operating, that you need to think about a world without that in order to be able to really think about justice and bringing real justice. So critical resistance is amazing in terms of the ability that we now have, which is to create this place where those of us who've been trying to understand and think about these issues for a long time could feel at home. And that's, I think, her contribution, her thinking, her organizing has made that possible. And so if you are interested, you can go to criticalresistance.org to learn more, to see more about what that work looks like. And I think the last thing is that critical resistance is, and other people who would maybe see ourselves as abolitionists, think about the importance of dismantling the PIC, the importance of changing it, but then the importance of building something else to replace it. That doesn't ever leave. It's not just about dismantling what currently exists, but it's about building something else in its place, which will actually be liberatory and emancipatory and allow us to live with justice and not violence, not replicating violence with other forms of violence.
I'm going to ask Joy if you could talk a little bit more about the issue that I mentioned in the introduction about the uses of Angela Davis in contemporary pop culture and politics, the uses and or misuses, the commodification, and the use of her iconography to put forward ideas that aren't necessarily ones that she would ascribe to herself. And she's written about this, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit.
Right. She talked about her hair and being reduced to fashion, and that's a multiracial, multicultural engagement, right? It's not just whites who've reduced her to a physical presence, you know, sort of a revolutionary sweetheart or a cutout doll. But blacks have too. For some weird reason, I don't watch TV, but I was watching last night in the hotel, and Eddie Murphy was doing a monologue where he starts talking about her afro, you know, with a lot of expletives in his storyline. So I hit the click button. But this way, you know, I think when people see revolutionary, we've sort of talked about this or written about it before, it's masculinized. So you think if there's anyone who's challenging the state, talking about white supremacy, talking about capitalism, imperialism, maybe not so much around sexism and heterosexism, it comes in a male form, right? And for a woman to emerge and to be as articulate, as thoughtful, and as radical is an anomaly. And, you know, this is true of Davis, this is true of Assata Shakur, this is true of others. But Davis, I think, is more embraceable as an icon, in part because, as Tracye, as you point out, I mean, she's an academic, so she comes with all the trappings of respectability. And she also has, you know, in her youth, as Kathleen Cleaver's and others, I mean, they have this physical beauty, right? In a culture that's highly visualized and also incredibly sexualized. And the historic role of sexualizing black women sets the larger context, right? And this appears in her trial when she's, you know, the prosecution strategy is going to be that this lascivious, out of control, impassioned, I mean, every stereotype of the black female persona is going to be channeled in to derail the persona of a revolutionary. So American culture is a culture of consumerism. So we're addicted to icons like we're addicted to shopping. And this film, you know, I said it was beautiful, and it is, but it's also another iconic formation. So it can also seduce you into thinking about revolutionary struggle as if it's always picturesque, there are only beautiful people in it, that it has a happy ending, and that multiracial coalitions always work. Because in relationship to black life, they don't, right? And so we're kind of, you know, we're navigating the presentations of ourselves and our self-representations under incredible stress and duress, but it's just not going to be as graphic as someone being on death row, particularly now that Mumia is off and you have his documentary out, Long Range Revolutionary. And, you know, I'll stop here, but there, you know, I love film, but there's something also about film being a pacifier and a, you know, a warm cup of, you know, chocolate or a nightcap.